What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. The holidays have come early. Patch day is today. So in today's video, we're going to recap what went live, seeing if there was any changes, and as well discuss what's going on with the game of Overwatch PvP with all of these nutty changes. Huge buff to gameplay, of course. While You Wait is now active, allowing you to play while queuing, which is great, but the significant change is the massive reworks to the tanks, to turn most of them to lower the barrier power and instead make all of them more interactive. While doing so, they reverted the armor change, so the tanks that have armor are slightly more durable, and Brigitte and Torbjorn especially have stronger matchups against certain heroes. Keeping in mind, spread damage is what is affected the most by this. Big spikes of damage, whether from headshots or projectiles, often have high damage values, get affected less. So there's sort of a Venn diagram of the changes of what does and doesn't get affected, but this low key may create some special breakpoints that change the game significantly. So keep this change in the back of your mind, because it may be far more significant than it appears on the page. As for the tanks, though, extremely important. You may have heard about the old Orisa buffs on the PTR. Well, most of that still remains the same, but they removed one key patch note, which is going to have a much bigger effect than you think. So what stayed in was the base armor increase up to 250, the barrier nerf down to 600, and Fortify being reduced to 8 seconds, a shorter cooldown than even Zarya's personal bubble. But what did not go through is the movement speed buff while she's firing Fusion Driver. On the PTR, it had a 10% buff, which made it feel like she was on ice skates when shooting, and I can't describe how much that movement matters to her ability to shield dance, to duel, to distance control. You can think of her ability to move to scale on so many different levels, whether it's brawling, dodging damage, or dealing damage, just to be able to get up to the spot that allows you to even see the target or chase them down. The interactions of move speed is so important. So there is a chance that a lot of what we've concluded about the patch hinging on Orisa being insane may feel a bit different going to live. Now, the durability aspects of her will remain. The new playstyle that requires you to have a much more bursty approach, similar to how Winston engages, but in a different form, obviously, with very little shielding to go around, that remains. But I'm not so sure that she's definitely the Terminator she was in the PTR version, and the gaps of her play where, sure, you can't kill her, but she struggles to help her team, that is going to be even more significant than it was on the PTR. She's unkillable, but if she can't move as fast while shooting, there's a chance where she can't get to the play while you go focus the rest of her team separate from her. Reinhardt got some of the nuttiest reworks of them all, where he moves faster while shielding, although his shield has less health overall, 1600 only total, and Steadfast gets a huge buff up to 50%, but it's only against knockbacks, which there are many of course. Lucio Boop, Far Concussion Blast, things like that. Rein really can hold his ground now perfectly. It feels like those effects do nothing, but remember that there are still other forms of CC like May Freeze, Orisa Halt, and various different stuns that still affect him fully. Last two tanks that got changed, D.Va's defense matrix had the cooldown between uses put down by half a second. It used to be 1 second back in the day. They nerfed it to 2. Now they split the difference between those points, and now it's 1.5. Most people agree that this makes her playable at times, but not necessarily meta. I think more likely than not, she'll play sort of a spoiler role to certain strategies where if she can counter them hard enough, it's more likely, I think, that you'll rather not get set up to get countered by D.Va and something else will default to be top meta. From all the testing we've seen thus far, it feels like D.Va does her job, but more likely the enemy will just pick heroes that aren't weak to D.Va, and then you'll have to go to some of the other tank staples. Possibly the biggest loser in the entire patch is Sigma, with his experimental barrier dropping all the way down to 900. Might be a little bit too much, but perhaps the sacrifice that was needed in order to push the game into being more interactive. And as well, the barrier regeneration rate goes down as well, and they do buff kinetic grasp, dropping 3 seconds on the cooldown, which is a pretty big deal, and also increasing its effectiveness, where you now get 60% conversion ratio from the enemy shooting into it. The biggest gains you can imagine coming from this is like eating an ultimate, especially like Whole Hog, for example, really farms up those shields quick. But Kinetic Grasp is pretty gimmicky, especially in comparison to Fortify. And for reference, Fortify has an 8-second cooldown, and this one is 10 and much weaker. Now, granted, Sigma has other crazy offense, which is making the kit kind of difficult to balance, but most people seem to agree that this leaves Sigma without much to do because he's just so flimsy. His barrier feels paper thin. He doesn't have armor health at all, which is a key thing to remember. When armor gets buffed, having it sure helps. I think he'll still look playable in very specific spots because there's no other tank that can do all the things he can do. I'd only advise for high skill players to do that. There's probably easier routes to value, but with such a high skill cap, I still think Sig can work. But the logic of Kinetic Grasp having a longer cooldown than Fortify when Fortify is so much better either is a mistake that I think is going to get rectified, or is Blizzard assuming that the rest of his kit is just so good that you're supposed to lean on that to get value? I mean, the thing is, Grasp is so weak that you might not even want to use it every 10 seconds. You know what I mean? Like, it needs to have a cooldown that's short enough to actually help him tank. Totally fine with the barrier being weak, but I think Kinetic Grasp is going to have to get a bit stronger before Sigma sees significant play. But I don't think most of us will complain if characters like Winston and Reinhardt take up his position next to Orisa as one of the best tanks. Now, one last tank change was to Zarya, where the explosion radius of her ult fire gets half a meter increase, but remember, a radius is from the center point to the outer point, and it's in a big area of effect, so that number is actually incredibly important, and the ammo cost reduced, meaning that you can shoot more of them. So Zarya's ability to do damage with her ult fire went up, and keep in mind, her primary beam, though got buffed through that beam improvement that went into the game a few patches ago, they did revert down her damage a bit since that point. So now I think her damage output might lean a bit more heavily towards the splash. Possibly. You don't need to be tested further, but if you're hitting multiple targets with the ult fire, now that you get an extra shot per reload, it might actually be better than using primary fire for dealing overall damage and farming up ult. We've reorganized the patch notes here based on what I think are most important. So this Moira nerf has got to come next. Dropping her healing from 80 a second to 65 down by 15 is a pretty huge nerf, but I don't think it kills the character, actually. Moira is a incredibly flexible character in 222 since she got those resource buffs, allowing her to use her kit much more freely. That was like many patches ago. They changed the drain rate of her resource and how it regens and stuff. And because of that, I don't think they ever really scaled the value that she gets from using her primary heal. And it still may not be weak now. It's less powerful, sure, but it's still quite a lot of healing, and no other character in the game can put out as much when you combine her primary heal with a heal orb. But I would stress from testing the patch myself that this means it's much harder to throw damage orbs without harming your team significantly, because you'll need that heal orb more often to do enough heals to keep your team alive. With the efficiency of how this plays out, I think Moira needs her heal orb more because of either one or two things. Either you use too much resource now just using your primary heal, or the spike of healing isn't enough and you'll need the outrageous amount of healing of combining both the spray heal and the orb heal together. But when you adapt your playstyle to fit with this patch, the fact that Moira has a 6-second fade and is pretty scary in duels, defends herself, just a very durable character altogether, there's still a chance she's still pretty darn good. Now, the last few patch notes for you to keep in mind: grappling hook cooldown has been increased from 10 to 12 to try to limit Widowmaker's carry potential against the lack of protection you're going to have now that barriers take up a much smaller percentage of the game. Torbjorn's overload cooldown has been decreased from 12 to 10 seconds. Not a huge fan of this buff because these characters hurt ranked more than top level play, and I feel like this is the kind of buff like they've done to Reaper and in the past where just to try to tweak pick rates or something, we make something that's kind of annoying stronger. I think this one's kind of a mistake. Torb's not going to get picked at super high levels unless he's broken, so I'd rather they not buff him to be obnoxious at lower levels where he's already pretty good. Keep in mind, he did get a ultimate charge buff recently on that quick patch that went through during the Mercy skin event. But perhaps the thought process from Blizzard here is that a character like Torbjorn has less protection because there's less barriers. The same can be said for Bastion, of course, who probably is just unplayable now. But because Torb is so durable himself and can dynamically throw his turret on the flank, don't think he necessarily needs barriers, actually. So I think that route's kind of a mistake. Last up, Genji gets 2 extra volleys from his primary fire before needing to reload, with his ammo increasing up to 30. This one definitely helps because the playstyle of Genji requires extremely fine tuning to the point where you can get those dash resets. And if you don't have enough ammo to finish a kill, well, you can be stuck out in no man's land without having your big escape or being able to chain multiple kills together. Genji's looked good in the EU Pro Pugs, but as I said before, I think he's just too hard to play. Now, because he has Reflect, he may be able to battle some of these snipers, but thankfully, at least in the ranked context, early stages of this patch have looked like the hero cast has kind of been opened up a bit in terms of counters. So if the enemy has a diveable hit scan, and you want to play Genji to take space against it, I'd imagine that still work. My only concern is that I think once everybody's kind of broken the patch in a bit, characters like Genji, who we would wish could stay in the meta somehow, I think likely are going to fall to the wayside, but only time will tell. We're going to have to get onto the patch and start testing it out in a competitive environment, which should lead for at least a few days of really awesome games because this patch is way more interactive than the last ones have been. So I look forward to getting into it and breaking it down further. Let me know your experiences by either leaving them in the comments or tweeting us what combos you think are broken or how you're receiving this patch. Are you having a lot of fun? Let us know at Your Overwatch YT. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out. Let us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon so that you actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for Your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.